The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Independent of Trump's tariffs, the U.S. Department of Commerce increased its duty on Canadian softwood lumber from 14 to 35%. Kim Haakstad, the president and CEO of the BC Council of Forest Industry, says it's a blow to an industry in trouble. The war in the woods in the early 1990s led to the Forest Practices Code, which in turn led to ongoing changes in legislation that hampered the industry and has seen more than 40,000 jobs disappear. The reasons the forest industry is on its knees have more to do with regulations and approval processes that undermine the economics of forestry. Haakstad says wood availability is at historic lows. Permitting systems are gridlocked, and investment is retreating in the face of prolonged uncertainty. The risk is not a gradual decline, it's accelerating closures, job losses, and the permanent erosion of the forest industry. Despite promises from the Premier and the Minister of Forests to restore the sector by increasing annual cuts to 45 million cubic meters, Haakstad says we need pragmatic actions that will streamline the issues that are choking the industry. I invited Kim Haakstad, the President and CEO of the BC Council of Forest Industries, to join me for a conversation that matters about saving the once mighty forest sector. We can't call it a mighty forest sector right now, can we?
Well, I think that the history of the forest industry in British Columbia is really important to the future of it too. And part of that is the sustainability of the industry. Do you know that on the coast, we're actually starting to harvest third generation of trees, right? So we've managed it well. We should be proud of our history, and we hope to find ways to have a bright future.
But it's all of these regulatory processes that have gotten in the way. I remember going way back to the 1990s when the Forest Practices Code came in. I was in Port Alberni with a chief forester from a logging company, and he started to take binders of regulations and he started to stack them up. They went to the ceiling.
Well, in a more recent story, in 2020, Kofi mapped the process to cut a tree from the moment that you decide to enter into a cut block to the moment that you get a log to a mill. And we went to update it now in 2025, and the consultants that did it said it would have to be completely redone. So that's how much change there's been in the industry in just 5 years.
Completely redone.
Completely redone.
It's crazy. So I think one of the things to point out, of course, is that the forestry sector in British Columbia, you have the coastal sector and then you also have interior. The coastal has been in much greater challenging economic circumstances for longer than the interior, but it's now throughout the province.
Yeah, and as we think about it, for sure there are the two different sectors, but right now they're struggling under the same situation, which is a shortage of logs that are coming to the mills, right? So while they're very different growth cycles, different tree mixes, they are challenged by the same issues right now, which is the regulatory complexity.
So what happened that suddenly, let's take the mill in Williams Lake, owned by West Fraser, they were running 2 and 3 shifts a day. Now they're having trouble maintaining 2. What happened in the legislative environment that cut back their access to wood?
Well, you know, we're now at a process where it's taking 2 to 3 years in some cases to get a cut permit. You know, I was in Chetwynd last week, and the log yard was empty at the mill there. But I was in Grand Prairie in Alberta as well earlier this week, and those log yards are full. So it really is a difference between the regulatory system that we're operating under in British Columbia versus one in Alberta that looks more at how to support the industry and make it work.
Give me an understanding about the one element that I've not really been able to fully grasp is it now says you can only get wood from a particular region or cut block. You can't be bringing wood in from outside of the jurisdiction that mill is in.
I'm not sure that that's the case. Right now, you know, most mills do depend for a portion of their supply from their local tenures that they hold with the province and the areas that they operate in. They also can buy from First Nations and others that hold and own those tenures, and so they get logs from there. And they also should be able to get logs from BC Timber Sales, which is the government's own mechanism for getting logs to market. But that is really dramatically underperforming its targets every year. So part of the shortages is actually that in each area where we can get logs, there's backlog and issues that are stopping the ability to cut.
So then maybe that goes back to what was the total allowable cut at 30 million cubic meters, and now they're looking at increasing it. But is that going to be enough?
Well, so the total annual allowable cut in British Columbia is actually 60 million cubic meters. We cut just over 30 million last year, and industry and government have declared a shared goal of getting to 45 million cubic meters. And from an industry perspective, we really think about that need to get to the 45 million cubic meters as an opportunity to keep the mills alive in the province and to make sure that we're still responsibly managing our forest, because that 60 million cubic meters, everybody recognizes a little out of date. There's been substantial forest fire seasons, the last parts of the beetle harvest. And so there are some where we need to update it. So industry is willing to recognize that 60 might not be the number, but we're certain that the allowable annual cut should be more than 45 million cubic meters. But we're willing to take that as an interim step to, if you build a pathway to success, you can grow from it. Right now, we're paralyzed.
So at 45 million cubic meters, is that enough to sustain the business? And in addition to that, ensure that there's a reinvestment in the sector?
Well, we think it's in the right direction, right? And, it keeps the facilities that we have today open and functioning and gets jobs back to having full operations at the mill. So actually running 24/7, running 2 or 3 shifts, whatever the mill wants to do. Most of them are at, if you were 3, you're on 2. If you were 2, you're 1 right now. And so that's really how we get people working in forestry dependent communities again.
By adding more shifts, by having greater access to wood.
That's right.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Where are we at right now as far as our ability to access the labor force that we need? Is that a consideration as we're seeing the economics changing?
Well, it's actually really interesting to go out and meet with people that work for the forest companies in communities. And I was back to Chetwynd last week. I sat down with their woodlands team, the folks that actually plot and figure out what they're going to harvest, how they're going to harvest it. And there was people that had worked at the company for 30 years and people that had been at the company for 3 months. And we have this brilliant generation of young forestry professionals coming up and into the workforce. Because we don't have all the mills operating at capacity, we don't have labor issues right now or labor shortages right now. And people still do want to get into forestry because they do see it as a way to meet the needs of housing and, toilet paper, if you want to talk about that, and other products that we make from wood. Well, at the same time as working in an industry that really does have a sustainable ability to use natural resources and invest in the long-term health of our forests.
A few moments ago, you mentioned the situation with wildfires. Mm-hmm. How much has that been hampering the industry's ability to meet some of its targets?
Well, the interesting part after wildfires is if you get in really quickly, you can still get dimensional lumber cut. But if you wait, then you can't. And if you wait, for a while, you can still get logs that can be turned into pulp and paper. But in Alberta and Saskatchewan and other provinces, they're actually working with forestry companies to make sure that they're able to harvest that fire area as soon as it's cool enough to get on the ground. In British Columbia, it's taking so long that wood is decaying in the forest instead of getting to the mills and helping with getting economic value out of that asset that otherwise would be lost.
Is that just a regulatory issue? Why is it different here than it would be in Alberta?
Well, we have a timing issue right now with how long it's taking to process permits. And so it is related to the exact same issue that is happening for the normal cut of the mature trees that we want to harvest when they're appropriately ready. It really is all related to the same problem.
I keep hearing this issue over and over and over again. That the getting the processing, like to get permission, is just making everything like stuck. What are the issues that make it so difficult to get to permit?
Well, first and foremost, it's just the regulations have changed so dramatically in the last few years that they still haven't settled into the system, right? We still haven't figured out how to work with them. And we haven't fixed the unintended consequences of what might be well-intentioned policy, but isn't actually working in practice. And so we have to look at that. We have to make sure that the Ministry of Forests has the resources to actually review the permits and move them through. We have to make sure the Ministry of Forests has support from the whole of government, because there's permits that come from water, land, and resource stewardship. We have to work with the Ministry of Transportation on roads. The Ministry of Indigenous Reconciliation gets involved. And so we actually need to make sure that we're not leaving the Minister of Forests and the Ministry of Forests alone, and that all of government is actually supporting the move.
How do you do that then?
Well, I mean, we're pleased that Premier Eby declared forestry a major project in British Columbia and said that we should be looking at forestry, which provides high-paying jobs in every corner of British Columbia, the same way as we're treating some of these major infrastructure projects that are time-limited. If you get people working in forestry, they stay in communities, and when you go visit facilities, you talk to families who've been working in the industry for multiple generations, and we want to keep that going.
What do you think happened to our focus on forestry? Because it used to be such a key part of the economy, and people were passionate about it, both for and against. But you don't hear much about it any longer, other than the fact that the sector is in trouble.
Well, we just recently did a public opinion poll that showed that support for forestry is strong, and really interestingly, that there isn't really a rural-urban divide on forestry, which was surprising to me. I've been working in politics in British Columbia for almost 30 years, and on almost every resource area, there's always been a bit of a rural-urban divide, but we didn't see it. And so forestry does have a unique position here, where broadly people do understand that British Columbia was built on the forest industry, and that the forest industry can have a bright future. And, we don't address our housing shortage if we don't get logs to mills and build lumber and plywood to build those homes.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So when we take a look at some of the major forest companies in the world, I mean, British Columbia is a home to a few of them, but those major companies are pulling back from their investment in British Columbia. What are you hearing from your members about what are the driving reasons behind them saying, well, we'll go to Alberta, or we'll go to southeastern United States, or even Europe?
Yeah, I mean, some of the biggest forestry companies in the world were built, they were born in British Columbia, and we should be so proud of that. And they've expanded to other jurisdictions. Part of that is softwood lumber and making sure that they have some diversity. But the other thing is that they're also expanding in Canada and not British Columbia. And that's where we really need to look here at home and look ourselves in the mirror and say, why are people investing in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and other provinces to the east of us, instead of here at British Columbia? Because if the conditions existed here, they would invest here. They're born and bred here.
So what's the major reason that you would give for the answer to that question? Why are you going away? Why aren't you doing it here? Because I remember when John Horgan was premier and he became aware of this, he went, shame on you, you should be investing here. But I thought, well, if you're running a business and the economics don't work, well, why would I?
Exactly. And I think, we've gotten in this habit of managing the decline of the forest sector in British Columbia instead of focusing on the competitiveness of it. And, we knew that there was going to be a reduction in the number of mills and facilities when the mountain pine beetle harvest ended. That's always been something that British Columbians have understood, and certainly conversations that we were having when I was in government in the early 2000s and in 2011 to 2013. We knew that was going to come, but we have more than lost that capacity now, and we're getting to a point where, the forest industry, each component of it, the pulp mills, the sawmills, the bioenergy facilities are dependent on each other. And if we lose any more facilities, we'll start to lose that interconnected ecosystem that actually makes sure that when a log gets to a mill, that we're using almost the entire log, right? Like we take waste and make bioenergy, we take sawdust, we make MDF, we take wood chips and we make pulp and paper, and we make dimensional lumber. It's a really, and then there's a whole secondary manufacturing sector that has the potential to continue to grow in the province, but it only grows if you get logs to mills for that first cut in order to continue to move it up the value chain.
So I have to ask you, when it comes to the increase in duties from the United States, apart from President Trump's tariffs, why did the U.S. Department of Commerce say, no, we're increasing this duty? What were they say? What did they say we were doing wrong?
Well, it goes back to their belief that because we harvest off of Crown land or public land in British Columbia and Canada, that they believe that there's a subsidy, where in the US they harvest off private land. And so they believe that that's a more appropriate market. But, when you look back, when we've challenged the softwood lumber decisions over time, Canada's won. So, what we really find is when we unpack how the US is determining the duties, that it doesn't really stack up in a way that we agree with. So we continue to be concerned that that there's an outweighed view of why it is that they think that the U.S. should have more production.
Well, of their own, yeah. They feel that their own homegrown sector can't compete with ours. But I don't know that that's true.
Well, we make different products is one of the things to remember, right? We harvest what we call Western SPF, or spruce, pine, and fir, predominantly in British Columbia. We have other products too, particularly like cedar from the coastal industry. But spruce, pine, and fir lumber is a core export product. In the United States, they make something called southern yellow pine. It grows faster, and when it grows faster in those warmer climates, it actually isn't as high a quality for things like building homes, renovating homes. So people actually prefer our product. It's actually not an apples to apples comparison when you try and trade out southern yellow pine for Western SPF. So that's part of it, right? Americans, part of the reason that our market is still, or the Canadians still fill about 25% of the US lumber market need, is because they prefer it.
So with the imposition of these new duties, how is that going to impact sales of Canadian softwood lumber in the US? If customers still prefer it, will they continue to buy it, or is it going to have an adverse effect?
Well, we don't know what the breaking point is on what is going to be the point where they say it's too expensive. But, we all know that the housing crisis exists in the United States the way it does in Canada. And, major cities and smaller communities are all grappling with this issue. So we've got to get more homes built. So there's still going to be some demand for that. But we don't know what that breaking point is, and that's why we're really concerned. And this might not be the only duties that the Trump administration puts on the lumber industry. So we're also concerned about a potential layering of tariffs.
So I found it interesting when the minister responded to the increase in duties, immediately turned his attention to point the finger at the White House and say that this is an attempt to ruin the British Columbia economy. Your response was, let's look at what we can do at home.
Yes, absolutely. Because let's focus on what we can control, right? We can't control what the United States does. We can control the hosting conditions for any industry, but in this case, forestry in British Columbia. We can have a regulatory system that works. We can work together in partnership with First Nations and local communities to make sure that we're striking the appropriate balance of, the environment, economic benefit, economic value, and Indigenous reconciliation. We have to continue to work on that balance, right? Nothing will be successful in British Columbia or Canada if we don't do that. But, we have to have a regulatory environment that allows that to happen.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So you can't just do one thing and hope that it's going to make it work out. What are 4 or 5 key issues that you would like to see the government move on that industry, First Nations, environmental, regulatory agencies can all say, yeah, we can work towards that goal?
Well, one of the things is that right now there's a large number of cut permits that have been submitted to the Ministry of Forests that have not been yet approved. So let's figure out what the reasons are that those have delayed, and let's get them approved. Or if there are no, let us know, and we will submit different cut permits. So we've got to look at those.
So don't leave us hanging in limbo.
Don't leave us hanging in limbo, right? 2 to 3 years to get a cut permit is too long. We also, as a government, there's a lot of different permits that any project requires, and every one of those requires a referral to a First Nation. So First Nations communities are getting really backed up in the number of referrals. But the way the system works, First Nations have to fund those referral offices with their own source revenue. So if government's going to put all of these decisions on nations, and there's lots of good reasons to do that, we also need to make sure that they have the capacity to work through the volume of permits.
I've heard this same argument when it comes to mining.
That's right.
They go, the First Nation is not that they're just saying we're opposed, it's just we can't. We don't have the resources to be able to examine everything at this point.
Yeah, and when we talk about BC timber sales, they represent about 20% of the AAC in British Columbia. So we need to make sure that they're getting their share. So if we're talking about the 45 million cubic meter goal, then 9 million of that needs to come from BC timber sales. But they are dramatically underperforming their own targets. And so we need to get BC timber sales functioning again. Minister Palmer has a review that we'll see released, I think, in September that will make some recommendations on that. As a forest industry, we're really focused on making sure that we're looking at the things that are recommended by that committee to get fiber or wood to mills. And, there's some other laudable social goals within that and the potential for some expansion of the BC timber sales mandate. Let's be a little careful about those things. Like, let's not expand the mandate of an organization that's not meeting its current one. Let's give it some time to grow and fix the problems that exist today.
What can we do to improve the investment climate in the sector in British Columbia?
It's really all of those things, right? Like, if we could show that, the current BC budget forecasts a decline in forest harvests over the next 3 years. But the political commitments say that there'll be an increase. If we can start on a path to actually meeting that 45 million cubic meter target harvest, that's going to be a really good signal to companies that it's worth investing their dollars here. If we don't reverse that trend of decline, though, why would anyone invest?
Well, will we see more mill closures? Because we've seen enough of them in the last couple of years.
I mean, I'm super nervous that we will see some more mill closures. And when I think about that, I think about all of the wonderful folks that I've met working in the forest industry in communities all across the province, 4,800 of which are Indigenous. And, there's about 100,000 jobs in British Columbia right now that depend on the forest industry. And those are in communities, many of which are still really forestry dependent. We can't continue to hollow out the communities that depend on forestry in order for people to continue to live there.
Bit of an odd question here, but do you think that the actions of not only the White House, but the U.S. Countervailing duties and so on are actually going to force our hand to maybe address some of the things that we have been dragging our feet on?
Well, I mean, we should look at it from both a short-term and a long-term perspective and see if we can find some opportunity within a crisis, right? And so, we can look at some of the short-term measures that I've been talking about, which really are the things that get logs moving to mills. And then we need to work on the longer-term pieces, which are continuing to develop our mass timber, which is tall wood building industry. We need to continue to invest and develop our international markets, which, Canada Wood Group does a lot of that work. The tall wood building work is done by an organization called Woodworks BC. Both of those organizations are working hard to make sure we have market development. The federal government has made a commitment that says they want to look at growing the number of homes that are built in Canada and built with wood. That can help. So there's a number of different levers we can pull longer term, but short term we really need some immediate relief to help us out so that we can get through to those longer term solutions.
Are you optimistic?
I'm nervous, I think is the right thing to say. I want to be optimistic, but we really have to move to action before I would say that I am.
Thank you, Kim Haakstad, for coming in and spending this half hour with us.
Thanks, Stu. Thanks for having me.